Story 1. When I was 5 or 6 years old, my grandparents, aunt, and I went to the lake. I didn't know how to swim then, but for some reason, they let me go into the water alone on an air mattress. I floated far enough away from the shore, and then I accidentally fell into the water and began to drown. The last thing I remember is slowly sinking to the bottom of the lake, with the surface of the water shimmering beautifully in the sun above me. The next second, I was on the shore, and my aunt was scolding me for my decision to go into the water alone. It was scary, but to be honest, the way the water looked while I was drowning is one of the most vivid memories I have. Story 2. I work in the Navy. One time, while underway on the submarine I serve on, we were having a great time and were about halfway through our mission. Everyone was alert, staying on top of everything and ensuring all tasks were completed. I woke up, got dressed, shaved, and showered, then headed to my watch station for the day. As I descended the ladder, everything suddenly went dark. All machinery sounds stopped, and we lost full power. I then felt the submarine start to list as the aft end went down and the bow rose, and we were about to flip. Suddenly, power was restored about 45 to 60 seconds later, and I felt the submarine correct itself. Great times. Story 3. I was diagnosed with cancer and began an oral treatment following 2 operations that hopefully removed all the cancer cells. The immunotherapy consisted of 2 powerful pills intended to attract and kill rogue cancer cells, hoping they wouldn't attach themselves to any organs. A month into the treatment, I began experiencing serious side effects that completely incapacitated me. One side effect involved me crawling through muddy grass into a tunnel with a bright light at the end. In the bright light were my recently deceased brother and sister seated on throne-like chairs, encouraging me to join them. For some reason, I stopped at the end of the tunnel, hesitated, and turned around. I will never know if it was just a dream or a near-death experience, but I do know it scared me tremendously. Story 4. I had bacterial meningitis in 2003. I spent 3 weeks in a coma and on full life support. I lost both legs below the knee, 2 fingertips, and some organ function. I was 23 years old. Story 5. When I decided to outrun a train while walking home from work one night, I felt it brush past me just as I reached the other side of the tracks. Do not attempt this. Trains may appear to be moving slower than they actually are due to an optical illusion. Story 6. After my cesarean section, I experienced extreme itching from the morphine used in my spinal block. 24 hours later, I could no longer tolerate the itching. It felt like I was going psychotic, as if bugs were crawling under my skin. They decided to give me a shot of diphenhydramine in my 4. I had a very unusual reaction to it. My blood pressure dropped significantly within seconds, and I thought I was about to die. I remember telling my husband I didn't want to say goodbye to my daughter yet, and about 10 medical staff members rushed in, panicking. I pretty much blacked out after that and have little recall of what happened. They informed me that they couldn't explain why that occurred, but advised me to avoid taking diphenhydramine again. Story 7. I don't think my experience counts because it wasn't accidental. I spent months fighting for my life in the intensive care unit following a suicide attempt. However, as I attempted it, I felt immediate regret and wanted to undo what I did, but it was too late. Today, at 22 years old, I have 4 debilitating health conditions, excluding post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of my actions. I cannot walk without mobility aids, and I am dependent on disability assistance. I ruined my life, but I didn't end it. Story 8. I had leukemia and developed sepsis when I was a child. I wish it was something more interesting instead of my body failing for no reason. Story 9. I was in Puerto Vallarta and took a tour where you can ride horses through the locations where the movie Predator was filmed. The tour ended at a bar with a rope swing which you could use to jump into a pool. I used to be a competitive swimmer and diver, so I wanted to impress my friends. I went off the rope swing and did an awesome backflip into the pool. When I hit the surface, I realized how shallow that pool was. All I saw were rocks rushing up to my face. Thankfully, my momentum carried me just 6 inches away from them. I remember standing up, shaking, because I felt like I saw my life flash before my eyes. 6 more inches, and I would have either been dead or trying to communicate through a speech-generating device. Story 10. I have a million experiences. Seriously, it's like Final Destination over here. Most recently, less than a month ago, I heard extremely loud cracks while walking on a sidewalk. I thought they were gunshots, so I looked around. An entire tree fell on me. I mean, from roots to bough, an 80-foot tree fell on me. It missed crushing my head by inches. Story 11. The first time I went hiking, I was foolish enough to wear worn-out shoes, and it suddenly rained on the way down. I slipped and slid about 3 to 5 meters while frantically trying to grab onto the remaining grass. I stopped just by the edge of the cliff. Story 12. I was working the night shift when we got robbed. While I was trying to hand over the money, the robber accidentally cut my wrist with a knife. I have a medical condition that prevents my blood from clotting, which worsened the bleeding. Due to the loss of blood, I began to feel lightheaded. Fortunately, the police were called, and an ambulance rushed me to the hospital where they treated me with medication. The doctor later informed me that if I had bled for 3 more minutes, I would have died. Story 13. Climbing in the Franklin Mountains, which run through the center of El Paso. 2 friends and I were attempting to reach a natural spring called Cottonwood Springs. As I came up over a boulder exposing my upper torso, one friend accidentally dislodged a large boulder, which came crashing down toward me. There was nowhere for me to go, so I just froze. The boulder came right at me, split in half, and both pieces went around me just like in a cartoon. We all froze, and then from above I heard, "Sorry, Stone," which is my name fittingly. We continued up to the spring with no further comment or incident. Story 14. A person almost hit me in the face with a crowbar. I experienced organ failure for about a minute and lost control of my bodily functions. I regained consciousness to find my girlfriend crying, telling me that I had died. Later, a kind user would inform me that I didn't die. I only experienced cardiac arrest. Okay, thanks. Story 15. Bilateral pulmonary embolism. I had numerous blood clots in my lungs, and I could tell the doctor was concerned. I couldn't move or breathe. My chest hurt, and I felt lightheaded. This occurred in 2021, and the nurses initially thought I had COVID-19. I felt as if I was leaving my body, and I knew it was serious. However, I persevered and only had to stay in the hospital for a week because my mom, who used to work as a personal support worker, agreed to care for me at home. It was very frightening. Story 16. I had a stroke in my eye on my daughter's 16th birthday. The doctor said if it were in my brain, we would be having a different conversation. Story 17. In 2023, I experienced the worst sore throat I have ever had in my life. Then I developed migraines, a high fever, rashes covering my entire body, and difficulty breathing. I realized this was more than just the flu, so I went to the emergency room, which is a standalone facility. Blood oxygen saturation levels are supposed to be between 95 and 100. Mine was 75, so the nurses at the emergency room called an ambulance for me. I was diagnosed with adenovirus pneumonia and a bacterial lung infection. I was in isolation in the hospital for a week. I was not allowed out of my room or to have any visitors, except my parents, because they had already been exposed by that time. Anyone who entered my room had to be fully masked and wear protective gowns. It was very surreal. The doctor said it was a good thing I went to the emergency room when I did. Story 18. I took every medication allowed for childbirth just to avoid the epidural. I ended up in an emergency cesarean section because I was too affected when it was time to push. The father was meeting the baby for the first time while being handed single-parent pamphlets while I was still in surgery. For months later, I had an ectopic pregnancy that ruptured my fallopian tube. I left the hospital an hour after arriving because my 4-month-old was upset without me. I went a week with it on the verge of bursting, but if I had waited any longer for it to be completely removed, I could have died. Safe to say, I am never getting pregnant again. Story 19. I was involved in a car accident on a 2-way street with 2 lanes on either side. The left lane was backed up, but the right lane was clear. A car turned left from a shared middle turn lane, while I was driving straight in the right lane. The driver clearly did not pay attention to the fact that the right lane going in the opposite direction was completely clear. The car was only 6 feet in front of me, and I was traveling at the speed limit, which was 35 miles per hour. There was nothing I could do. The airbags in my car did not deploy, so perhaps the situation was not as severe as I initially thought, but I was terrified. Another troubling incident occurred when an angry ex-boyfriend drugged me at my job. He knew exactly where I kept my water bottle, and he was the only person I knew who would have access to those kinds of drugs and any motive to harm me. I also almost got hit by a car while walking home. Story 20. I was smoking outside a restaurant on a very windy day when suddenly my sister called me. I walk when I speak, so I started to walk. 2 seconds later, a double-glazed window was blown by the wind and fell from the 4th floor to the exact location where I had been 2 seconds earlier. Thanks, sis. Story 21. I was in my Camaro in recently stopped traffic on the expressway and was rear-ended by a driver on his phone going 75 miles per hour. The car was totally destroyed, but my son in the back seat was unharmed. I was mostly okay too. I also was born not breathing. I spent about a month in a bubble after almost dying from whooping cough or croup. I never got a straight answer on that one, but I definitely remember it. I had a substance overdose in my 30s after my wife left and my mother passed away. All I remember from that were all the pretty colors. Story 22. My dad was washing his white laundry and decided to add both vinegar and bleach to the washer, not realizing it would create chlorine gas. Story 23. I went to the hospital because I had not been able to go to the bathroom for 3 days. When I arrived, they said I was septic due to a perforated colon. After several surgeries and 2 weeks in a coma, I witnessed terrible and frightening things, such as bats flying out of people's mouths. However, I also saw my deceased mother and brother, which provided some comfort. Overall, it was a scary experience. Story 24. There is a condition called Kawasaki disease. Mostly male Asian infants are affected by this illness. I was given an advantage with slightly expanded veins and a slight vulnerability to hyperthermia. Story 25. I crashed my car a few years ago, but I was lucky and walked away with only some scrapes, bruises, and a concussion. Story 26. My husband had septicemia from food poisoning, then developed a deep vein thrombosis in his arm, and subsequently was diagnosed with thyroid cancer within 3 months. Story 27. Not near death, but still an unforgettable experience. I was a spectator at the 2013 Boston Marathon. I decided to watch the finish line for a few minutes and then left to get some ice cream. This was maybe an hour or less before the bombs went off. Story 28. Rock climbing caused my entire right side to suddenly shake. I couldn't grip anything as my hand was affected too. I fell and bounced around 30 feet, primarily landing headfirst. I landed with my head positioned between 2 rocks. I spent a few weeks in the hospital with various broken bones. Story 29. Bilateral pulmonary embolism almost took me out. I was lucky to be in the hospital when it happened. My sister was visiting and got help. Story 30. I fell off the hood of a moving car during a reckless teenage night. I suffered a traumatic brain injury and had a fractured skull in 2 places, along with a broken tailbone and a brain bleed. I am now unable to have children. Story 31. I was almost caught in a storm that later developed into a tornado. A tree fell in front of our car, but luckily we were able to swerve. It was an incredibly frightening experience. Another time, I was run off the road into a median, and thankfully I didn't cross into oncoming traffic. Story 32. Acute pancreatitis after a gallstone attack at 21. I no longer have a gallbladder. The doctor stated there were over 50 stones built up. Story 33. I contracted sepsis and was hospitalized for 10 days. When I was discharged, I was informed that I had almost died several times. Story 34. Almost shot in the back by a rifle. Almost shot in the head by a rifle. Almost blown up by an automatic grenade launcher. Almost had a helicopter land on me. Story 35. My bedroom was involved in an automobile accident. It was going uphill, so most of the impact was absorbed by the hill, but it still made a truck-sized dent in the stone side of the house. Had it been 2 feet to the right, it would have hit the gas meter, and I probably wouldn't be typing this. It happened at about 12:15 on a Friday morning while I was struggling to get to sleep. My eyes were wide open until around 6 that morning. Story 36. I was 7 or 8 and out in Cancun with my big brother and my uncle. My brother, who was 14 years old, was a good swimmer, but my uncle and I, who was morbidly obese, weren't great swimmers. My beach ball went too far, and when I went to grab it, I got caught in the riptide. My uncle came to try to help but got stuck as well. My mom was on the shore, so I screamed for her, waving as high as I could and kicking my legs as hard as possible. Later, she said she thought I was saying hello. I just remember I couldn't swim anymore and was going underwater and breathing in. The next thing I remember is feeling like my brother was waterboarding me by dragging me across the waves by my swimsuit strap while I was trying to crawl up onto him in panic. I have no idea how he managed to carry both of us, but he definitely saved my life. Story 37. I was on holiday, sightseeing in my rental when I encountered stopped traffic on the interstate. I tend to watch the rearview mirror, and I noticed a large motorhome approaching rapidly, thinking, he doesn't look like he's stopping. He really doesn't look like he's stopping. In an instant, for things happened simultaneously. I thought, he's not stopping. I yanked the wheel to the right. Thank goodness I was in the right lane. I accelerated onto the shoulder, and I looked out my side window to see the motorhome crash into the car I had been following. Story 38. I was shot multiple times. 8 times in the back, side, chest, stomach, arm, and neck. The experience felt like a dream. I didn't feel anything. It was as if I were air itself. As I was dying, I could feel each body part shutting down. I literally felt numb, as if I had a rock instead of an arm, leg, or stomach. Felt like I was floating away. I remember walking around the house. Everything looked like a disco ball, but instead of seeing lights, I could feel and smell everything that had ever happened in that specific spot. I then saw my deceased mother and spoke to her. She told me I had to choose whether to go or stay. The front door opened, and a cool fall breeze filled the air. I started to walk out the door. It was a trail in the woods, and it was winter outside when it happened. I was barely a foot out of the doorway when I heard my son yelling, "Dad!" I replied, "I'm not ready." And then I woke up to my son hitting me while crying. I managed to get to my phone and call emergency services. I passed out and woke up in the hospital. Story 39. Naked cliff jumping. I hit the water from about 25 feet up, emptied my lungs, and started to sink like a rock in a few hundred feet of water. The world was a fading sepia tunnel filled with black spots before I managed to break the surface. Story 40. I almost drowned while learning to swim. The floaters were blown off due to a really windy day. I couldn't float or get back up, and I didn't know how. My dad rescued me. Story 41. I almost drowned once while swimming too far in a lake. I made it halfway before I started to sink and had to claw my way above the surface. A friend helped me out. It didn't hit me until a week later that I almost died. Watching a video of water made me have my first panic attack. Story 42. Abusive ex-boyfriend. I was about 15 years old and he was also 15. We were in a long-distance relationship, but twice a year I would make the journey across state lines to visit him. The first visit was a disaster. My mother accompanied me and stayed in a hotel while I stayed with his family. What occurred behind closed doors is something I don't wish to repeat. I was terrified of leaving him because he had a habit of manipulating me. His friends would send me photos of his self-harm to guilt me into staying with him, saying that he would harm himself if I didn't stay and be happy with him. He would refuse to eat, shower, sleep, or do anything if all of my time wasn't dedicated to him. I couldn't have friends, and even hanging out with family occasionally was a problem for him. During one of my visits, we were hanging out with a few of his friends when the topic of masculinity came up. One of them decided to play a game to declare who was more masculine, me or my boyfriend. I immediately sensed that this would turn sour and tried to convince his friends to stop, but they didn't listen. They confidently stated that I looked more masculine, and I could see it in his eyes how angered that made him. He wouldn't dare act on it in front of his friends, though. When we returned to the house, he was visibly upset. I managed to convince him to eat something, offering to cook for him because I was frightened and needed some way to appease him and diminish the hatred in his eyes. He reluctantly agreed, and I started cooking pasta. I was shaking the entire time, and at one point, I dropped the box of uncooked noodles on the floor while waiting for the water to boil. I think a total of 10 noodles scattered out of the box. But my boyfriend immediately saw red and rushed over to me. His kitchen had an island in the middle, and I was crouched down in front of the stove picking up the box. He quickly wrapped his hands around my throat with a grip that felt like it could crush my windpipe. It wasn't a warning hold. There was intention behind it. He squeezed my airway to the point where I couldn't breathe or scream. About 5 seconds into it, I heard his dad walk into the kitchen, which prompted him to immediately let go. Since we were behind the island counter, his dad didn't see anything. My boyfriend gave me the look of, "Don't say a word." And I didn't. I was absolutely petrified. He barely ate, I barely ate, and later that night, he covered up the marks he left on my neck with hickeys to conceal the bruising. Of course, I wasn't going to oppose that either because I was terrified he was going to try to harm me again, this time inside his dark bedroom with a locked door. I swear that if his dad hadn't walked in when he did, he would have killed me. I saw the intention in his eyes. It was clear as day, and it was absolutely terrifying. Story 43. I flatlined for 12 minutes due to sudden cardiac arrest. I truly empathize with that football player who experienced this on the field and how he tragically died in front of everyone. I was placed in a coma. Story 44. Last year, I fell through my garage ceiling while not paying attention to where I was stepping in the crawl space. About 16 feet down onto concrete. Nobody was home. Luckily, I tried to grab a beam on the way down, which meant I pretty much landed on my feet and then fell forward. I easily could have smashed my head open or, at the very least, broken something. I had intense pain in my arm when I found myself on the ground, so much so that I was certain it was broken. It had just been badly scraped and bruised from being skinned by the beam I tried to grab. The crazy thing is, I was in a deep depression at the time and thought, "Careful! You could fall and hurt yourself, even smack your head and die." Then I thought, who cares? Story 45. A truck hit me on the road after I didn't look left again at a stop sign. He was going 75 miles per hour, and he hit me at the back of my front tire around where my legs were. My airbags didn't deploy and I lost consciousness. Somehow, I was just a little sore. Story 46. I have chronic back pain from my scoliosis and was experiencing severe flare-ups. But that's life with chronic pain. A few days later, I started my period and had the worst cramps I've ever experienced. I've always had difficult periods. That's life. One night, I woke up freezing cold and couldn't get warm. Then I began to vomit persistently. I tried to drink some water but couldn't keep it down. My mother found me curled up on the bathroom floor, cold, lethargic, and deathly pale. She had to help me to the car so we could go to the emergency room. It turned out I had a kidney infection that had progressed to sepsis. Story 47. Going down at 70 kilometers per hour on a bike on a road where a car was approaching from the front. The only way for me to go was off the cliff. Luckily, I had disc brakes, which saved me. Story 48. I rolled an all-terrain vehicle in the middle of the jungle in Indonesia. It flipped and slid in the mud down a steep hill, rolling right over me. I have no idea how I walked away unharmed. My husband was behind me and witnessed the whole incident. He said it was one of the worst things he has seen, thinking I had been crushed. We laugh about it now, remembering the time I nearly died. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.